this approach, sort of language that Farage himself would use, do you think it is politically effective?
I think we need to have a different approach. Otherwise, we're simply saying we must do what Reform want.
What do you think the net effect of those kinds of phrases is on a community? What happens?
I personally don't like that sort of language. It encourages local communities not to be welcoming to strangers, not to be welcome to newcomers, not to be welcome to people who have arrived here.
So you think the language is, at least to some extent, reminiscent of Powell?
Yes, I think it is. Certainly, it's made people draw the comparison. So the answer is yes, and I regret that.
That is Lord Alf Dubs. He's a Labour peer, and he's a former child refugee. And he heard in Keir Starmer's immigration speech yesterday the language reminiscent of Enoch Powell.
Dubs is, in many ways, the moral conscience on immigration of the Labour Party, arguably even of the country. So powerful is his story as a Jewish child fleeing from the horrors of Nazism on the Kindertransport. These words, on a day when Number 10 is being forced to reject the charge that he has channeled Enoch Powell, will carry weight and force. We've been speaking to him exclusively on the show today. Welcome to the News Agents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And 24 hours after Keir Starmer made that pretty jaw-dropping speech on immigration, many people are discussing not just the policy changes that have come in, but the choice of language. And on the episode yesterday, we discussed some of those phrases, the island of strangers, the idea of a lab experiment, and this whole question of whether Starmer was essentially cloaking himself in what sounded rather like someone else's words, given his own views, his own well-known views on immigration up to this point. And today there has been a slightly farcical situation of cabinet ministers having to go on the airwaves to defend Starmer from sounding like the right-wing firebrand, in brackets racist, Enoch Powell of the 1960s. Yvette Cooper, his Home Secretary, has said that Starmer's words are completely different. Starmer himself has completely rejected the suggestion that he echoed Enoch Powell. But arguably, if you're explaining this, you are already on a losing wicket, because people have started assimilating some of Powell's words and remembering particularly the River of Blood speech, and wondering whether there aren't at least echoes in some of the phrasing and some of the imagery that Starmer was using yesterday at 8:30 in the morning.
And Enoch Powell is a figure long dead, but is a figure that occasionally pops up and haunts British politics. And younger listeners in particular and viewers might not know much about him or remember what he did, not least because the moment with which he is most associated happened in 1968, and it was a speech which became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. He made it in Birmingham. He was at the time a shadow cabinet minister, serving under Ted Heath, who was then leader of the opposition. And he intended it to be, that is Powell. He was always a maverick kind of figure. And he said before he delivered the speech, he intended it to be fired off like a rocket that would light up the sky. And he basically, I think, set off in this speech the kind of age that we've been living in ever since, because he was making an argument. And the argument basically was, and it was remembered for the incendiary language, some of which we can hear in a minute. But the argument was basically one which actually we would be very familiar with today, because it's an argument that certainly mainstream Conservative politicians make quite regularly, and even arguably the Labour Party and Keir Starmer have started to make as well, which is simply that the UK cannot ever truly assimilate at least a good proportion of the people who are coming, that they will never be truly British, partly because of the numbers, partly simply because of their culture, and partly because of who they are. Just listen to a little bit of that speech that Powell made in Birmingham in 1968.
In 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. Well, I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? My answer is that I do not have the right not to do so.
A lot of that speech is actually lost. There's only a partial recording of it, which is extraordinary when you consider what a big impact it made. And you had kind of people, the Dockers of London, come out in support of Powell. Ted Heath actually sacked him because of making that speech. Language that I think would not get you sacked today in a lot of ways. Maybe some of it would, some of it wouldn't. But the reason that Starmer is getting criticised today is because of that line which, Emily, you mentioned, where he talked about mass immigration making us strangers, or strangers on our island. And Powell used a line which I think he meant differently, but obviously has some of the same evocations. He said that the rate of immigration had made British people found themselves made strangers in their own country.
Exactly.
So you can hear how it might be reminiscent.
Yeah, and Powell at the time, when he was making this speech, opposed the Anti-Discrimination Race Relations
Indeed,
Bill,
that was the
which
context.
ultimately became law, and he was particularly rejecting of the rapid influx of people coming in from the Commonwealth. In other words, the sort of the Windrush generation, as we now think of them, and that's why he was, at the time, he was called a racialist, not a racist, but a racialist. Although what is weird about this, and you're right, he was sacked by Heath, then sort of recommended to people that they vote Labour. But the polls at the time, and there is a range, but the polls at the time show that between 67 and 82% of the British public actually agreed with him.
There's huge support for him.
And so this is what I think brings us back to essentially where we are today. And, this whole question of the Overton window, in other words, the acceptability of both policies and language. Has something massively shifted recently, or has the British public always been in a slightly different place to their politicians on what they felt able to say? And I guess, that there is no way that Keir Starmer will ever come out saying Enoch Powell had a point and yes, that was what I was trying to do. But there will probably be voices around Starmer saying, just hold your nerve on this one, because actually you said something that the British public were more than ready to hear. In fact, they've been telling you in all the polling that has gone for reform that, yes, they do want to hear somebody who is pretty hard line on what is happening to our country. And again, that whole question of us being an island, an island makes us sound unusually nativist and separate and not part of the EU mainland, which of course we're not, as opposed to just saying the nation or the country.
And that's the point. I mean, when you talk about the Overton window, Emily, one of the reasons why actually so much of British discourse now is very Powellite is that central argument he was making was that, and the thing that was so controversial at the time and which has echoed through British political history ever since, is this argument that Britons would in some way lose themselves, that they would lose their country, that they would lose their identity, that they would find themselves a minority within their own country. Yeah. He talked about the black man having the whip hand over the white man.
In other words, dominance to the native, the indigenous population.
And that newcomers didn't just want equality, they wanted superiority. They wanted to actually become the majority, right? Now, Starmer wasn't obviously making those arguments, and I think in some ways it is absurd to say that, make a comparison between Starmer and Powell. Obviously, they're completely different. But it is true to say that the whole direction of the discourse in British politics, and I think actually that is one of the things that was problematic about Starmer's speech yesterday. You and John were talking about this yesterday, but it was problematic, is that so much of the discourse on this has basically moved in that Powellite direction, which is weird in a way, right? Because you could tell, I mean, I've been to enough far-right rallies, I'm not in a personal capacity to say covering them, but I've been to enough of them, and anyone who's seen them will have seen, and this is how powerful Powell continues to be, the banners they always carry, which is Enoch was right. Yeah. Enoch was right? And actually, there's a very different story you can tell, right? Which is that actually, Enoch was really wrong. We've had way more immigration than was the case in the late 1960s. And despite that fact, I think anyone would be hard-pressed to credibly make the argument that Britain has lost its identity, that people who have come, who are second generation, third generation, from wherever it is in the world, Poland, India, wherever it happens to be, are somehow not very successfully well integrated in British. Of course, there are pockets where that is not the case, but generally you can argue that in the 50 years or so since Powell made that speech, actually the story of British migration has largely been a success story. And yet, that thesis that he prosecuted at the time continues to have such resonance, such power, and in fact, partly at Keir Starmer, a Labour Prime Minister's own hand, has in fact gained greater purchase, perhaps even than it did 48 hours ago.
Yeah, and I think one of the complicated things about that is that places where immigration has been highest, where it's been sort of most heavily felt, have been in London and the big cities, which are the most comfortable places of all with immigration. In other words, the places where you don't get many immigrants are often the places where the polling against immigration is the highest. But I think Starmer's prosecution of his policies yesterday, I think, will not find that much pushback in terms of what he said is the numbers are too high. The numbers, they are high. I mean, if you start with where Cameron was on the tens of thousands, a limit of the tens of thousands, and we're now, under Rishi Sunak got to just short of 1 million, that is a massive, massive leap. And actually, if you're talking about the speed of change, I think most people would say, yeah, hang on a second, this all happened too fast, too big, too heavy, and as a country, we can't cope with these numbers. I think that's a very, very different argument to have than the one that talks about squalor, that talks about incalculable damage, and that points a finger at something that has gone wrong. Because what he doesn't do in any of what he said yesterday is talk about the benefits, is talk about the economic calculation that having more migration into the country has. And that is something that most economists, agree on, that we could not function very well. We could not grow our economy very well without people helping us out.
Well, it is the question, as you say, not so much of the policy. And some of the policies, frankly, they're completely uncontroversial. When he says, anyone who has to speak English, anyone who wants to come here has to speak English, I think anybody would really disagree with that. There are lots of things, perfectly sensible changes which he proposed. But nonetheless, it is this question of language which is exercising quite a lot of the Labour Party and parts of his own coalition. Not least Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, perhaps the most prominent figure so far to come out and take issue with what the Prime Minister said. He was talking to our colleagues on LBC this morning.
How do you feel to hear a Labour Prime Minister talking about that word squalid chapter? Not an unacceptable chapter or an unreasonable or an unsustainable chapter, a squalid chapter. And an island of strangers.
Well, those aren't words that I'd use.
But how did you feel?
Well, look, I read the white paper,
okay,
and I understand the context of the white paper, and those aren't words that I'd use.
At one point, I think James O'Brien goes on to say he's talking about your mum and dad. He's talking about your family members. And obviously, I don't think you can argue for a second that there was a racist undertone or overtone to Starmer's language, but there was a sense of somehow keeping the indigenous separate to the newcomer, which clearly makes you feel that what has gone before wasn't very welcome.
So as I say, this is something that the Labour Party is talking about, certainly the Labour left are unhappy about. But there are others as well, not just sort of the usual suspects who are unhappy about the Prime Minister's language. And someone to whom, as we were saying at the top of the show, the Labour Party, but even the country, can look to when thinking about immigration, certainly matters of asylum, is Lord Alf Dubs. For those of you who don't know his story, he has been on this show before talking about it at length. That was about 18 months ago. But he is a very well-known figure within the Labour Party and elsewhere because he is one of the survivors of Nazism. He was one of those who came across as a child from what is now the Czech Republic, from Prague, on the Kindertransport. These were the famous trains of children, which were unaccompanied children.
Had to leave their parents behind but survived the Holocaust.
Indeed so, arranged by a great hero, a man called Nicholas Winton, who arranged that before the start of the Second World War. It might just be worth just listening to a little bit of that conversation that we had with him when he came on this show, just talking about his memories of that time.
I was 6 years old. I was one of the youngest, and they went up to 17 or 18, and it was quite dramatic. I can still see in front of me, in my mind's eye, Prague station, German soldiers with swastikas, anxious parents saying goodbye to their children, not knowing whether they'd see them again. So it was all quite dramatic.
And most of them probably didn't.
I think quite a few didn't. That's true. And indeed, some of the parents who did escape often escaped via remote countries. Some escaped via China, for example, and eventually made their way to the UK. So it was a complicated time for people, and of course many of them were fleeing in desperate circumstances.
And more recently, he has been the author of the Dubs Amendment. This is a bill that he tried to get passed through Parliament, which enabled a number of unaccompanied child refugees to come and live in the UK, even if they didn't have a straightforward family link here. In other words, he has devoted his life to this question of what a host country should be doing to welcome refugee children. Now, obviously, we're not talking about child refugees. We're not talking about asylum seekers. We're talking about something very different, which is net migration, legal migration into this country. But I think where Alf Dubs becomes, as you say, the moral authority is in recognising the importance of language, in telling the story about who we as a country are. So we're going to start by asking what he thinks when he hears Keir Starmer's words. Here's a little reminder of what he said yesterday.
Today we publish a white paper on immigration, a strategy absolutely central to my plan for change that will finally take back control of our borders and close the book on a squalid chapter for our politics, our economy and our country. Let me put it this way. Nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not. Now, in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together.
Lord Dubs, do you have some sympathy with what Keir Starmer is trying to do there? What did you make of the language that he used?
It's not language I personally would have used, because I remember way back we had a Home Secretary under the Tory government who talked about people coming here as being invaders. If we're going to have support by local communities for people who come to join us here, then I think it's important that we don't have senior politicians using language which suggests they're not welcome here. That's the first thing. Now, Keir Starmer didn't say that, and the introduction to the document, the white paper, is actually worded very well. So I wouldn't have used the word island of strangers, but I think what the government is trying to do overall is probably quite, on balance, sensible, although I do have some reservations about parts of it.
He talked about the incalculable damage of high net migration. He talked about ending a squalid chapter of rising inward migration. Do you understand why he's using those kinds of phrases?
I wish he weren't. I personally don't like that sort of language. I didn't hear it myself, except when you played it just now. But I don't think it makes for a good outcome, because it encourages local communities not to be welcoming to strangers, not to be welcome to newcomers, not to be welcome to people who have arrived here. And I think that doesn't lead to happy outcomes. So I think we should realise that local communities in Britain tend to be very supportive, particularly of asylum seekers. They tend to be helpful. They tend to want to make sure that they take part in local activities and so on. And that is good. And that's the sort of society we want to be, even if the total numbers are a bit high.
Can I just ask you what you mean by not leading to a happy outcome? What do you think the net effect of those kinds of phrases is on a community? What happens?
If senior politicians, and I repeat, I quoted the previous Home Secretary, if senior politicians use language which is not welcoming of people who have arrived in this country, then local communities will feel less likely to be supportive, will feel less likely to go out of their way to welcome them and help them to take part in local activities. So the outcome is that we don't have communities that are as happy as they might be.
You've talked about, and you came on this show about 18 months ago to say, Lord Dubs, how unhappy you were with the language Suella Braverman used, talking about invasion and invaders, in talking about an island of strangers, in talking about the incalculable damage that migration or uncontrolled migration has caused. Do you think that the Prime Minister's words are rather too close to comfort from the sort of language that we've heard from Conservative politicians like that in the past?
I wouldn't have used that language myself. put it that way. I think I would have been a bit more careful, as he is in the introduction to the white paper, where I think his language is much more measured in tone. So I repeat, I wouldn't have used that language myself. But on the other hand, I know what the government is trying to do about the immigration numbers, and they are on the high side. And I think the government is right to want to reduce them. I criticise some of the methods they're using, some of the details, but I think overall the government are right.
You know Keir Starmer. Does it sound like his sort of language, or do you feel that he's parroting language that's been put in front of him?
I don't think it's his sort of language, frankly. But equally, I don't like to suggest that he's just doing what he's told by other people. That puts me in a difficult position. No, it isn't like him to talk like that. I heard him. I heard him on giving an interview yesterday morning, and his language was much more measured. His language was much more tolerant and decent, and I think that's the sort of person I think he is.
One of the political objectives, Lord Dubs, here clearly is to try and see off, to combat the rise of Nigel Farage and reform. Do you think that this approach, using this sort of language that Farage himself would use, do you think it is politically effective?
Well, I suppose the cop-out would be to say time will tell, but it's not the approach I would use. I think we need to have a different approach. Otherwise, we're simply saying we must do what reform want, and then we forget about people on the other side who are more progressive and liberal than the Labour Party ought to be. So the answer is I don't think it'll be that effective. It might be effective in some parts of the country, but overall, I don't think it'll be all that effective. However, I think sentiment will suggest that, yeah, the immigration numbers are very high, not asylum seekers, but the immigration numbers are very high. And I think sentiment will say, well, the government is right to be doing something about that.
People will know you and your story and how much you care about the refugee question, particularly for children, Lord Dubs. I wonder whether you think that there was an argument that he could have made which didn't have to appeal to people's compassion necessarily, but does appeal to their pocket just by talking about the economy, by talking about the wealth that is created, by talking about the way that migration has helped us as a country to grow, which doesn't seem to be part of this argument at all at the moment.
Well, he did say something like that in the white paper in his foreword. But yes, I think there is a positive side to it, and I agree with you. And I think migration into this country has been beneficial. It may be the numbers are too high now. I think they are. But the story of migration in this country has been that it's been positively helpful and has filled vacancies in jobs, provided skills we need, and generally made us a decent society.
There are some MPs, Lord Dubs, who have compared some of Keir Starmer's remarks, not all of them, but some of them, particularly this language around Island of Strangers, not just to Suella Braverman, but to Enoch Powell. You will remember that speech in 1968. Do you think that is language that Powell might have used?
Well, I remember Powell's speech. I remember the shock that we all felt at the idea that a senior politician would actually use such language, which denigrates minority people in this country. No, I'm unhappy that we have senior politicians who use language which is reminiscent of Powell, and I'm sorry that Keir Starmer used some of the phrases that you've just quoted. I'm sorry he did that because it's not the sort of person he is, and I don't think it's what he actually believes in.
So you think the language is, at least to some extent, reminiscent of Powell?
Yes, I think it is. Certainly, it's made people draw the comparison. So the answer is yes, and I regret that because they're very important things in the white paper about our immigration system, and I don't want those to be lost in terms of a debate about one particular phrase that Starmer used. I wouldn't want to lose the important things the government are doing. And of course, I wouldn't want to lose some of the criticisms that some of us will make of that particular white paper.
Lord Dubs, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lord Dubs.
Thank you.
Joining us now is Christiane Amanpour of CNN and soon of the podcast world at Global with her brand new podcast called The X-Files. Now, Christiane, we should explain that your ex-husband is Jamie Rubin.
Yep.
Who was Clinton's advisor?
He was in the State Department and with Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, during both administrations. She was first UN ambassador, then Secretary of State. And I have to be totally clear, this is Christiane Amanpour presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin.
As in,
He's
first.
the second. Oh,
No,
oh
as
my
in-
God!
no,
Shots
as
fired. 1
in that's
minute
the
in.
official bloody title.
Okay, fine. So let's get to the bottom of this. You and Jamie split up about 5 years ago.
7.
7
to
years
be
ago.
precise. And you, of
Okay.
course, knew him.
I know,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
because we're neighbours, we're
Yes,
friends.
yeah.
And Jamie then is living in the US.
Yes.
And I think he was advising with the Biden
He
administration.
was in the State Department for the Biden administration, working for Antony Blinken, and actually headed the really important department of combating disinformation and misinformation, which the first thing the Trumpies did when they came in, they killed that off. So, clearly they have a hangover from
What
the
do we want?
accusations
More
that,
misinformation.
that Russia,
Yeah.
interfered in 2016. So, yeah. What do we want? More disinformation.
More disinformation.
Yeah.
So Jamie's sort of out of a job, at least as far as the administration goes now,
Correct.
because he's not working
so,
for Trump.
So I had a ready pool of employees.
Right. And you called him? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I had this idea that I wanted to mix my CNN daily sort of show, which is 4 days a week, and try to put my toe in the podcast pool, because I'm clearly late to the game, but I see where things are going. And I think there's a real value, for me anyway, in doing the hard news, interviewing world leaders, doing what I do on CNN, and the legacy media and the reach it has around the world, but also trying to talk about these things in a, as you know better than I do, in a more personal, just a different, freer, more laid back kind of way. But for us, we've decided that as exes who worked for 35 years, and we're using this 35-year span of history from 1990 to today, when he was in the Clinton administration and I was in the field and doing this interview program and covering the same things, but from completely different sides of the barrier, and being married at the same time, which also was controversial and probably couldn't happen now.
Wow.
Probably couldn't. He doesn't think it could, and I'm sure.
Why is that?
Because I think that at the time, we had to convince people that there was nothing inappropriate, there was
That
no
secrets
conflict
weren't
of
being
interest,
passed, essentially.
secrets, information, scoops. His job was not just closest advisor to Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, but also to be the State Department spokesman. So, two things here. He had a lot of journalists to satisfy. I couldn't be getting all the scoops, right? Somebody would figure it out. And on the good side, his ability to talk to journalists and tell them just as much as he needed to is what helped us. He said, I can talk to my wife, a journalist, about these issues in the same way as I talk to people on the other side of the podium. And
Of course, these days he'd just be adding people to WhatsApp groups and
well,
sending them all the
there
secrets
you
anyway.
go. Luckily, he's smarter than that. But in the social media world, there's no way. I mean, we would probably have faced quite a lot of backlash.
And so the genesis of you doing it with Jamie, was that your idea? Was
Yeah,
that his idea?
actually.
Yeah.
I called him up when I realized that the Biden administration had lost and Trump was going to win, and therefore he'd be out of a job.
At a loose end.
At a loose end. And we had, we'd started to speak more civilly and, more friendly, and we have a son in common and everything.
To be fair, you had the only couple I know that had a divorce leaving party.
It's true.
It was lovely.
It's true. But did you know it was that at the time?
Yes, I think
Yes,
so.
I said, come and bid Jamie good luck heading west. That
It was the loveliest.
Is that the euphemism? Is that what we call it now?
No, he was going back to the US.
Oh, I see.
We were living
Right,
in
okay,
London.
right.
But the truth of the matter is, look, no divorce is fun. We had a son, luckily he was on the verge of turning 18, finishing high school, finishing his A-levels, on the way to going to university. But we always had great foreign policy conversations.
Yeah.
And he likes to say, from his government work, I told the truth, nothing but the truth, but not necessarily the whole truth. Now, in a podcast world, maybe I can tell the whole truth. And that's kind of where we are. And the idea is to pull back the curtain as well, and to go back to, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian disaster, or whether it's, Russia-Ukraine, whatever it might be, there's always a template. And a lot of this stuff unfolded in various forms during the 90s, early 2000s. And so we want to talk about the stories that we both have, and even potentially look at solutions and ways forward. And we figured, my sort of conceit about this was, if in this crazy world where you can barely get a Republican and a Democrat in the same room, here I don't know what it's like between Reform and Labour and Tory and all the rest of it, but the poisonous public dialogue has got to stop. And solutions have got to be found, and we have to model some kind of way out of the crises that we're in. So that's a grand way of saying, something kind of a bit funny, that if we can do it as a divorced couple, then surely anybody can.
And do you still disagree about a lot of stuff? Because
We do.
broadly you're on the same side, aren't you?
Broadly. We disagree about certain, attitudes to current world issues, and even back then, and on a whole load of other issues, otherwise we'd still be married. But but we're turning it into, it's actually really nice to restart the conversation. And I figured, and I think he agreed, these are a little bit desperate times, wherever you look. And in desperate times sometimes call for desperate means and measures, and this is one of them.
We're not calling this desperate, but tell us about the first episode, because you start with Israel-Gaza.
We do, because President Trump is in the Middle East. So he is visiting Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, notably not Israel. He will not be meeting with Bibi Netanyahu unless something changes. There's some kind of rumor and talk that maybe the new president of Syria will go and meet him. We'll see about that. We don't know for sure at this point. But yes, we decided to take on what is possibly the most controversial issue in our foreign policy and in our politics and culture and all the rest of it, whether it's here, whether it's in the US, and certainly the horrors that are going on in the field. And we thought, well, we'll talk about now, and then we'll talk about that moment of hope that was Oslo, that even going before that was, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, visiting the prime minister of Israel in, 1979 or whenever it was, and the King of Jordan.
Very far away,
it does, but it doesn't mean to say it's impossible.
But do you see any hope now?
I think it's hard, and you'll hear our conversation, but it's not impossible, because eventually and essentially it takes brave and willing leadership, and it takes convincing people on the ground. You'll hear Jamie talk about in the episode that launches on Tuesday, our first episode, that at the time, President Clinton was able to persuade the Israeli public and the Palestinian public that the US had their back and the US would support them. And the US got the historic grievances on all sides, and was ready to work for a secure and peaceful and dignified and sovereign states for both of them.
Christiane, one of the things that I think still doesn't get enough attention, because it's hard to sort of overcome it. You've reported from the field for many years. Indeed, when you first met your husband, that's what you were doing. The fact that still, after all this time, there is almost no, indeed there is none, foreign reporting from within Gaza. And that what there is reporting from a lot of brave Palestinian journalists, of course. But the fact that the Israeli government continues that policy is extraordinary, isn't it? And something
It's
that I think we don't talk about enough.
Let's just be absolutely frank. It's unacceptable. And we have made many démarches with letters, every time on my program on CNN, when I have an Israeli official, I make this point. But I will say first and foremost that we must pay tribute to our brave Palestinian colleagues, as you've just said, that, something in the region of 179 of the 263 journalists who've been killed over the last 18 months have been Palestinians, and other Arab journalists covering that area, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. And the fact that we cannot go in is a violation of Israel's own the basis for Israel's singularity in the region. It's a democracy.
Has it worked in the sense that one of the reasons, you hear this a lot from people saying, why isn't it being covered more? Why isn't it being covered with greater urgency? Part of that is the time. That isn't necessarily an acceptable excuse in itself, but the story has been going on for a long time. But it's sort of worked, hasn't it? Because there aren't the journalists
a
there
lot of Israelis
documenting
can't
it.
actually see what's going on in Gaza.
And the rest of the world can't either. We've got a sense, but we don't see that daily documentary evidence.
Well, I agree with you. This is very different from when I cut my teeth in Bosnia, and every single day we showed what one side was doing to the other side, and we showed the unacceptability of the slaughter of innocent civilians. I am not talking about a war between the IDF and Hamas. I'm talking about innocent civilians who are not just caught up in it, but are often targets despite what they say, and who form a huge amount of what they call the collateral
and who are being
damage.
starved at the moment.
Well, yes. And all you have to do is take it from Israelis themselves. The former Likud defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon, has talked very frequently in the last several months to the Israeli press, not to the foreign press, but to the Israeli press, in which he has raised the very troubling notion that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, is not following a strategy with an end game, but B, risks and has sent soldiers into situations which could be, and in some cases have been, adjudicated as war crimes. Cleansing, forcible transfer, using food and water as a weapon of war. This is not allowed. And for Israelis to start saying that about their government, they don't want to be stained by this. And I think the story also is very, very important. I don't think, from what I know from my Israeli colleagues and friends in Israel, they don't get to see even what we see here. It's not on the main news. Is there?
What
It's
do
not.
you think when you see those pictures of starving children?
What do you think I
coming
can
out?
think? What does anybody think?
Do you think it's war crimes? Yes.
You know what? I cover these things. I was at the ICC when they laid down an indictment on the issue of a total siege and using starvation as a weapon of war. So it's already been alleged, but it's something that Israel cannot afford. And of course, we mustn't forget what happened on October 7th. And I never forget, because it was such a horror. And I remember breaking down on the air when I was speaking to people who were wounded after the attack at the Nova Festival and elsewhere, talking to, family members who had seen their beloveds kidnapped and stolen for all these months, some of whom are still there. And then the nightmare every night of imagining what's happening in Gaza to the individuals, to the civilians, not to the Hamasniks, to the civilians, the women and children. This takes me back to Bosnia. This is, and it's really, really very, very hard. So our podcast has talked about also ways that we could emerge from this, ways that we have to have the kind of leadership that has to change this drama. And I will say, because you raised this, there's been some, I think, unfortunate reactions in quite a lot of the legacy and the mainstream media. In the United States, for instance, an Oscar-winning film, No Other Land, about the, settlers, storming land and the soldiers, all of which is written by the New York Times and the Israeli Haaretz and the Israeli, human rights organizations and things like that, couldn't get a platform. It won the Oscar for Best Foreign Documentary. It could not get shown in a theater, in a movie theater in the United States. Right now, you have this hullabaloo going on at the BBC, where internally there's quite a lot of pushback. It's now got into the Times of London. It's elsewhere. Full disclosure, my brother-in-law Ben DePere has made a film about the heroic doctors in Gaza.
This is not the same one as the one being investigated.
There's one film that I haven't seen but is being investigated. And the BBC appears to be saying that until we finish that investigation, we can't show this. And that's now...
This is Ben DePere, who some of our listeners or audience will know from his work at Channel 4.
Exactly, he was the editor there. And
so you think the BBC is just scared to show this?
I don't know what's going on, but we need to be able to tell the truth. And that's why I still think, despite all the podcasts and everything, legacy media is massively important, because you have to be able to go there, which brings us back to what you asked, being denied. I asked the deputy Israeli foreign minister on my show last week on CNN, we need to go there. You need to help us get there and tell this story. But I was rebuffed.
Why do you think it has been so successful? Because you're right, there feels that there is a chill wind in terms of, particularly of late, in terms of even talking about some of these things. Why do you think that's been so successful? Where do you think it comes
Because
from?
I think that when there's silence and when you, of course, it doesn't get out. I mean, I've been throughout my career in very many other places. People have said, kindly and nicely, "Oh, if only you were there in X place, things would get much more attention because it would be on CNN, it would be, here, there, and everywhere." So it's obvious that when you're there and you're telling the stories and you're pointing your cameras at everything that's going on.
But even when there has been, you just talked about the film which couldn't get the platform. Even when there have been examples of that.
Well, look,
there's
I've
been an
just said
attempt
what
to
I've said,
delegitimise.
and I hope this changes. I hope this changes, and I've noticed a lot more Jewish intellectuals, like in France, for instance, are beginning to come out and say, look, this is 18, 19 months, and we have to figure a way out of this because it's not good for any of us, and we still have our hostages.
Interesting that the hostage release that happened yesterday happened through Hamas and Trump behind Netanyahu's back.
Correct. Indirect talks between the Americans and Hamas.
And he has to pretend that he knew what was going on when he clearly didn't.
Yes, and to be honest with you, President Trump, who wields a lot of influence and a lot of throw weight, he is showing in public that he seems to be getting tired of the forces of war. He's tried to throw a bone to Putin. Putin has rebuffed him. His envoy to the Israel-Palestinian issue is also Steve Witkoff. And according to the Times of Israel, Steve Witkoff has also said that he's quoted as telling the families of the hostages that Israel is extending this war beyond what's needed.
So Trump has lost faith.
I don't know.
With Netanyahu.
I don't know if he has. I don't know what happens behind closed doors, but he's not going to Israel.
It's interesting he's not meeting him.
No, but maybe, and listen to our podcast, maybe it's carry on and you do what you have to do and finish the war. Maybe there's nothing to talk about. I don't know. But I'm hearing, we're hearing in reports.
Christiane, fantastic to have you. And your first episode of The X-Files. Christiane Amanpour presents The X-Files.
With Jamie
Global.
Rubin.
With Jamie
Let's
Rubin.
not forget. Let's not put salt in that particular wound.
We're not going to rub that one in. It's on Global Player as of today.
Yep, exciting.
Very exciting. Christiane, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, as you heard from Christiane, all eyes at the moment are on the Middle East and indeed Turkey, because Trump has landed in Saudi Arabia. He begins a Middle East tour there, which will include a meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. He has already met MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. He is not currently going to Israel, and we are waiting to see if he diverts towards Istanbul for this meeting on Thursday. President Zelensky of Ukraine has said he's waiting for Putin in Istanbul to begin serious peace talks there. We haven't had confirmation yet that Putin himself will attend. Presumably, Trump will now be waiting to see if Putin goes, and if so, we could very well end up with the three right at the centre of this whole issue there on Thursday. We'll let you know. Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.